Looking at our world, we're going to look now at the orbit actor, which is just placed at the origin of the world for ease. The way that I've coded this is dependent on that. It can't just sit anywhere in world space, so I've kind of locked it to that purely for this prototype. So if I click into that blueprint, let's have a look what's going on. So a couple of things just to point out while we're here. The habit I've got into is that anything that's triggered by event begin play, I always put in a little green comment box, and anything on tick I put in yellow so I can see it immediately. I'll also then use pink if I'm just using a bit of blueprint code to debug. And if there's an old bit of code that I'm not using but I don't want to delete, and if there's some code that I am no longer using but I don't want to delete, then I put it in a red comment box and add XXX to the name so that later on I can easily go through and find them and delete them. Because I'm still learning, I like to keep the code there to sort of look at and see what I've been up to. Basically. So let's have a look at what we're doing here. Before we start on the blueprints, let's look at the actor itself. Coming over to the components, you'll see that we have a rig, which is a sphere. That in effect is dealing with our interaction. We'll go into more about that shortly. And then I have a product static mesh component. So the rig is a static mesh component, the product is a static mesh component, and I've just got a decal on that for purely visual for the skateboard. And I have also got a rotating movement component in here, which is handling all of our rotation, pretty much all of our rotation, not quite. Coming back to the event graph. So event begin play, we're writing a reference of ourself, orbit actor, to the game instance, my favorite technique. Then other elements of our setup. I'm enabling input so that we have enable mouse over events and enable click events enabled in this actor. That's because we are using some of the events that depend on having these set, so we'll go over that shortly. I've then got a custom event which re-triggers from this point onwards when I am needing to recreate the references in the world that handle our HUD widget alignment. So rather than them building up, this is just the kind of spring cleaning. There should be an is valid in there ultimately, but I'm not worrying too much about blueprint runtime errors for this prototype. So that's just cleaning up any label marker actors before I create new ones based on the new static mesh. So product, here our static mesh actor, which is set to skateboard initially. Now that changes with the interaction with the HUD, and that will make sense later in the playlist. But what we're doing is we're looking at that product, getting all the socket names, and then running a for each loop that ultimately is the length of how many sockets there are. So that correlates. So just having the socket name drives how many times the for each loop gets triggered. What I'm doing with that though is I am spawning my label marker. So if you've not watched my widget container playlist, I strongly suggest you watch that, because that goes into this whole mechanic of deprojecting from world space to screen position and how you set all of that up. For each of the socket names, I'm spawning a label marker and then saving that into the array, same array here that gets cleared, when we re-trigger this custom event, which gets triggered when I swap the mesh, the static mesh, under product. But each of the spawned label marker blueprints gets attached to a socket, the same socket from the product itself. So that just means that we have our markers in the right place. And I've just got snap to target on each of the rules for attach actor to component. So the parent is our product static mesh, and we are using the return value as the target for each of the instances that we're creating. Let's just have a look at the skateboard. So you'll see there are 4 sockets set up with the names wheels, board, trucks, kick, which is actually the array element in terms of socket name, the array element that I'm bringing through and adding to the descriptor, which gets passed through to an exposed on spawn variable that is within the label marker. We're using the index to pass through as well, so that this actor knows exactly which index it is. So we're updating that as an integer in that actor as well. We're not actually using that now. I removed that, but you can obviously pass through a reference of the static mesh that it relates to. So we'll ignore that bit. So on completion of that for each loop, for creating all of the markers that attach to the socket, because they are now created and attached, I want that to happen before I create the labels widget, which is dependent on these spawned actors being in the world, so that the child widget can align to the world position through deprojecting to the screen. I urge you to watch the widget container playlist. So that's kind of set up. So in event tick, I am tweening some of the preset positions that rely on this custom event being triggered by the orbit HUD. So if we come to the orbit HUD, we can see that preset rotations in HUD probably not the best place. So this was a bit of an afterthought. When I built the prototype, I thought, really? Should these be in here? Maybe it should actually be in the orbit actor. So, you know, that's one of the things I really need to get a handle on, is making sure that, you know, of course you can build anything anywhere and reference it, but it's making sure it's in the right and logical place. So I've left it here for now, and more to kind of highlight the point. So what happens when we click, these are the preset buttons, 1, 2, 3, and each of those sets a local variable. We'll go into the orbit HUD in a separate video, but this is the bit I wanted to show. Because we've dragged our target rotation variable that's in the orbit actor here onto our custom event, it now means that we can pass through that variable. So I'm passing through that variable and setting the Boolean should rotation tween. And this event tick is dependent on that should rotation tween being true. So if that event tick is firing, nothing's going to happen until that condition is met. So coming back to our orbit HUD, you can see that I've got some presets that I've just kind of hard coded. These could obviously come through from a data table or somewhere else, but I've just put them for the purpose of the demo. And I am referencing the orbit actor, triggering that custom event, and thereby passing through that target rotation. I'm also disabling the rotating movement, because from the interaction that we'll go into in a moment, I'm setting this, and if I don't set this to 0, 0, once I've tweened to that rotation, that preset angle, the mesh will continue to rotate if there's a rotation rate set. So I'm wanting to make sure I remove that. So that's the same thing for those three presets. So you can see I'm taking that target rotation based on the current rotation and then doing an rinterp 2, taking the delta time, and I've just hard-coded the interp speed. But again, you know, that could be a variable. And then I'm just comparing the axe rotation to the target rotation and saying when it reaches that threshold, then trigger this branch and turn should rotate tween off. Set the boolean to false, and therefore changes the condition here, and false does nothing. That's the only thing on tick. So now looking at the navigation, there's a few things going on. So we have our rig, if you recall, it's that sphere, and I am using the onClick custom event, which is one of the ones that is down here, onClicked. I'm also using onBegin cursor over and onEnd cursor over, and that's why we enabled everything here, so that we can do that within this actor. So as a result of that, I'm doing a few things. I'm changing some conditions and updating things. So is product navigable when I'm clicking on it, and it's true, then it sets it to false. Because I've clicked, I'm also recording whether the mouse is down. If it is, then should it rotate? No. Get the mouse position on viewport, capture that and write that position on the screen position on the UI, write that to a variable mouse down position capture, which is on our orbit HUD, and then I am firing an event, a custom event on the orbit HUD, which is UI reveal on mouse down, and then I am creating the line UI, the start point and the end point, and then drawing a line using the onPaint function, which is one of the overridables somewhere. It's gone. Maybe it's not there because I don't know why it's not there. User interface, painting, onPaint. Again, we'll go into that later, but in effect, it's the little line UI from when I'm clicking. And then if the product isn't navigable, then it changes those conditions as well. There's some logic there that happens. So obviously here, this should rotation tween was specific to those presets. If I'm navigating again, I don't want the tweening of the presets to continue. So that's why we're turning it off in both states, because we're now interacting again. I've also just got an on cursor over event, fading the opacity of the material as we roll over the rig to give the user some feedback to state that they can now navigate. So that's just, that one's fading up and that one's just fading down. On the fading up, I'm also wanting to piggyback these conditions. So in terms of swapping the mesh, so I have got a custom event. In the same way, I've got an integer that I've dragged here from my selection and added it to my custom event because we're calling the swap mesh again in our HUD somewhere. Here on our clicking our right and left buttons, which are here, and based on the selection, which is an integer, just a number, it's getting that static mesh actor. So we've got skateboard, phone, headphones, and then updating the product static mesh component with that newly selected mesh based on the selection number from the UI. And alongside that, we're then updating the product title and the product price. Again, these are just arrays in here. It could be a data table, it could be a runtime data table, so being pulled in from a Google Sheet. But for the prototype, I've just coded it in this way. Refer to the real-time data visualization playlist to learn how to bring in data from a Google Sheet at runtime. And then I'm just doing a bit of kind of local tweaking, again, just for the purpose of the prototype. Based on the selection of, I've only got 3 here at the moment with the 3 mesh, so this isn't dynamic, this is kind of just hard-coded. I'm just tweaking the scales of the static mesh component and then resetting the legend. So if you recall, at the beginning we were clearing all the markers and then recreating all the markers. So that happens every time the static mesh swaps, and it's dependent on that static mesh swapping for the markers in the world to be first be destroyed and then respawned based on the number of sockets of the new static mesh. And then I've just got a mouse wheel up, mouse wheel down, affecting the scale of the product, so it looks like it zooms in. Of an increment on scale 0.03, which is tiny, but you know, it could be bigger increments. And I'm just affecting the scale here in this function where I'm getting the actor scale 3D of the mesh. I'm clamping it so it can't go above 10. If I keep scrolling up, it will just stop at 10. And then I'm just setting that variable as a reference and then setting the actor scale. So using the clamp just limits the range of me scrolling up or down. And that's all that's in the Orbit actor. So I hope that video is of use. If so, please do like and subscribe and hit the notification bell to receive any updates. And thank you for your support.